This week, time for a little detour outside of the national park scene. I'm taking a turn into a bit of a book era. A little bit ago, a fun tome entered my life. It's called The History of the World in 10 Dinners by Victoria Flexner and Jay Rifle. Gloriously, for my purposes, it ends with a New York menu that rests smack dab in the period we are hanging out in right now. And for the purposes of this particular episode, the 19th century menu with its cold smoked salmon, intricate aspic presentation of squab ballantines, chilled punches, chocolate souffle, and most of all, the Florida Alaska that requires ice cream and meringues all point to the presence of plenty of ice to pull off all these chilled elements. But the other reason I chose to introduce you to this history cookbook that covers 2,000 years of fancy banquets is that you can see the presence of ice and snow putting its thumbprint on just about every menu. The Roman menu asks you to chill the wine, and the shellfish have been stored on ice to keep them fresh until cooking time. The Baghdad menu has a dish of chilled carrots. The Silk Road banquet implies the presence of ice with its mango, melon, and jackfruit salad. Iced fruits were everything there. The Zabaione in the Renaissance menu would have been chilled by the confectioner to stabilize it for presentation, and the Spanish love of chocolate drinks led to a madness for iced chocolates being consumed in hot weathers. Anywhere the Spanish were present all over the world. So even though The History of the World in 10 Dinners is a cookbook that takes you into the global past, it's a fun companion to the history of American food because you see how all these threads from the past show up in our modern places and times, including the desire to chill. So check it out when you're thinking about how to literally spice up your next dinner party, and think about how much easier it is because you and all your grocers have really good refrigerators. Episode 122, Ice, a Curious Material. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the early American ice industry and the strange legacy of one man, Frederick Tudor, the Ice King of Boston, and how America's legacy as England's angry runaway child put us behind in the ice games, but left a lot of room for innovation. To hear about all that and the birth of refrigeration in America, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know, that as a temperate country, England was way behind in the use and appreciation of ice compared to just about all the rest of Eurasia, including the Persian lands, Arabia, India, China, Russia, the Balkans, the whole Mediterranean, the Nordic countries, and really anywhere the Silk Road had made an impression. Oh yeah, and North Africa. As someone who grew up in the U.S., a country that now feels the need for not one, but 2 fridges and maybe an extra freezer as well for every house in the suburbs, it's almost shocking that we spring culturally from a country that suffered from both contempt for ice, as well as suspicion of those indolent pleasure seekers that stored and enjoyed frozen water before it came from a machine. Now, if you're wondering what people were doing with ice in the early 19th century, if you're a rich person, it's pretty much the same what they had been doing with ice at the 18th century or earlier. But this episode is more about how the ice industry changed in the 19th century and how it was actually influenced by the global use of frozen water, either just before this time or much further back. England's distinct lack of sweltering summers combined with its notably gentle geography and strangely gentle winters mediated by the Atlantic currents meant it was way behind everyone else when it came to the desire for and the acquisition of frozen water as a food additive or tool. As a result, early America was a bit behind the ice times as well. This indifference to ice would be melted by the climate of sugar, rice, indigo, and eventually cotton regions of the American South. Lingering, sweltering summers would create a powerful craving for the cold stuff. The fishing industry mercantile precocity, and Puritan disgust at idleness and waste combined with the general mechanical curiosity of New England and the New West would create a hotbed of inventiveness that would drive America right to the front of ice acquisition, marketing, and the spread of the gospel of ice cold around the globe. In previous seasons, I touched on the use of ice in early America as something the rich did. Through ice cellars, they laboriously dug and filled using mostly slave labor. Over time, larger farms and some towns further north would do some communal ice cutting on local ponds, but all too often they would lack enough cellars and no way to get it to market, which meant that any extra ice would just melt back into the pond from whence it came. Henry David Thoreau whined in his literary venture, Walden on Life in the Woods, that his country retreat was disturbed in the winter, what he thought would be the quiet season, by ice cutters with both repurposed farming tools as well as some created particularly for the job. At the end of the chapter, The Pond in Winter, he points out that many of the blocks, because they were riddled with air or broken or beyond the cargo capacity of the venture, were left to melt for the next year and a half. So the first half of the 1800s was this time when America started to catch up with what was generally known as the Old World in terms of its affection for frozen water, especially out of season. Now, the way the story had always been sloppily told to me was that America more or less invented the possibility of refrigeration for the common person, which is actually pretty true, and then brought cold stuff to the rest of the world, which was not true at all. Instead, the rest of the world was a market for America's ice and cold because most of the world already knew what a thrill the chill was. See, it turns out that the ancient world had had a love of summer ice for centuries, and not necessarily where you'd think it would make sense. That is, until you look at maps with elevation on them. The ancient Persian Empire, post-Alexander Greece, Chinese empires, North African metropolises, and part of the later Roman Empire all loved bringing cold into the heart of summer. In some of these areas, the key was tall mountains close to population centers. It's also these areas that harvested snow. They moved it out of the mountains in late winter and early spring, usually on donkey back, and this cold treasure would be packed down in snow pits. With a drain at the bottom to keep water away from the frozen snow, they would be lined with branches and then covered over with more and less elaborate roofs or buildings. Sicily at the base of Mount Etna, parts of Europe that poked into the Adriatic, the southern side of Turkey, ports on the southern edge of the Black Sea, and cities in Spain at the foot of the western side of the Sierra Madre, cities ringing the Himalayan plateau, and the Atlas ranges of North Africa all would harvest snow for summer enjoyment. But for the most part, this snow was the purview of the wealthy. And since everyone knew the snow was being dug up by grubby laborers, transported on grubby donkey back, and then stomped in place by grubby feet, a fair amount of the snow was thought of as something used to cool stuff in containers, not as something to consume. Though a few extremely rich people would have snow specifically collected for eating. Meanwhile, in the Persian Empire, present and past, where its high desert plains, dry air, and wide daily temperature swings, those people weren't trekking off to go get snow. Instead, they were meticulously making ice right there in the desert from clean, carefully piped-in water from the distant mountains. By using a combination of shade walls, windbreaks, troughs, and night shift labor, the high desert plains of Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Turkmenistan, these old regions of the Persian Empire would make ice along and around domed buildings called yakchal and then store it inside. This ice, unlike the snow of the mountains further west, was clean and would actually regularly be put into beverages and consumed. And because these ice-making operations ringed any city of a decent size, ice was actually available to all but the very poorest, though even they might be given iced water to cool them down during their hottest labors. And ice appreciation was not just limited to hot places. In cities where there was plenty of cold, Norway, Sweden, the Baltic states, the Low Countries, Holland and the fancy new city of St. Petersburg, ice was harvested from rivers and used to cool off people, dairy, and even fish in the summer. So up through the early 18th century, there was a huge enthusiasm for ice, kind of everywhere except England. But with the English starting to place colonial outposts in all sorts of hot places, many of them caught the enthusiasm for a cold drink. Sharbats and julebs in Araby and Morocco, punch in India, even iced teas in China. And suddenly, in the mid-1700s, the English realized they could use, get this, ice to transport salmon fresh from Scotland back to the capital in London. I know, this is the country that built a global empire. It took them until the 1740s to figure out that ice would keep fish fresh longer. Anyway, this was also the age of the thermometer, the steam engine, and soon the vacuum pump and other mechanical and scientific marvels. In fact, it was the bringing of precision glass blowing together with lots of manufactured sodium chemicals and this new fascination with ice that Europe and England began to really get a hold scientifically on the fact that adding salt to ice made the ice, or the melt water really, colder, and that it could be used as a cooling agent to make containers of clean, edible ice and as a tool to freeze mixtures of other things to make icy treats. And as soon as this became well known, those icy treats were often frozen in fanciful shapes in metal molds, lead, pewter, and tin especially, which were all products of the new science and the new metallurgy. Fascination with science, life in new hot places, and the rise of the global sugar trade all made new, bigger markets for ice. I mean, iced wine and iced fruit have been with us for at least 3,000 years. They actually seem to be the big want that drove the innovations that led to the high desert yakchals. But while those things just sort of evolved naturally, the sweetened water ices needed the development of sugar crops around the Mediterranean. The sorbetos and granitas and snows or neiges of fancy Spanish, Italian, and finally French confectionery all grew out of the existence of more sugar and more salt and large food-making spaces in the huge, over-the-top castles, chateaux, and villas, all competing to throw the grandest weddings and other state functions. But iced creams, and especially specifically ice cream for the masses, that needed the coming together of cheaper Atlantic sugar, manufactured salt, dairy cow breeding innovations, and the rise of European ice houses, and most likely exposure to the metal kulfi molds that were present in India. Oh yeah, and cheaper paper for the broader publishing of cooking manuals, and a rising fascination with gears, which resulted in mechanically hand-cranked freezing tubs as well. Here in the 19th century, ice cream was becoming the new hotness, attainable for the rich and as an object of desire for everyone else. And that meant there was a swelling market for ice, even if just in the ice houses of the rich and for professional confectioners and limonadeurs, which is where our Mr. Frederick Tudor steps in. See, Boston's a low-lying burg. Due to the fact it was known for its boggy soil that grew cranberries real well, also meant it was littered with ponds that could be harvested for ice in the winter. By the early 1800s, it was clear that trade from the northern states to the southern, back and forth, raw materials and manufactured ones, things like cheese for rice and the like, was a profitable one. But nails and dyed cloth are quotidian, kinda every day. Sure, you can make a living at it, but not a fortune, and besides, it lacks scope and vision. Now, Frederick Tudor was a man born into pretty good money who also had big ideas. Now, quite a few of them didn't work out, but he was convinced this ice idea would. He looked at what was wanted, ice, and what surpluses were around him, namely cargo room going down south to sugar, cotton, indigo, and rice plantations, and sawdust. See, at this time, sawdust was industrial waste. It was dumped into the rivers that ran the sawmills and was clogging them up and killing the fish. And sailing ships were sailing more or less empty to the warm places that were growing the raw materials of industry. And so they had to use the ubiquitous New England granite as ballast. So using these two things, sawdust and empty spaces on ship, plus the novelty of the very idea of shipping ice, Frederick Tudor would build an ice company that would move Boston and later Greater New England ice all over the world, and he would become known as the Ice King. Tudor Ice first went to the Caribbean, then to London, and then to cities all along the Gulf of Mexico, as well as regularly supplying the ports of Baltimore, New Orleans, Charleston, and Savannah. Ports were later opened in South America, and the British Empire's reach drew Tudor Ice Company shipments to many of their southern outstations. Now, for a variety of reasons, largely resting on racism and a refusal to learn any language but English, colonial housewives in India actually came to prefer imported over local ice. Word of mouth and officers on the move spread the trade to places like Sri Lanka, then known as Ceylon, Hong Kong, and other Indonesian outposts, with a few shipments even going to South Africa and Yokohama, Japan. Now, fun fact, in the early days, the idea of a global ice trade was so new and strange that many of the ports that Tudor ships arrived in had no classification for foreign ice. If ice had been present, it was a domestic local product. So the international custom agents had to come up with new rules for this new substance coming in the doors. In some places, it was simply not subject to tariffs, as in India, where the British saw it as an important element in keeping morale up and keeping order within the ranks of the civil service. So it wasn't taxed at all. But in other places like London, ice ended up being taxed as a fabric. It existed in a curious place between produce, that is, something that was grown, and a manufactured item, something that was made. The first few times I heard the tale of Tudor and his global ice shipments, the gist had been that all these places were introduced to the idea of a cold drink by this trade. But as we can see, the desire and the knowing of how to use the ice, it was mostly already there. Well, for everybody except the English, who were astounded. But once the people with the money and in charge of the bureaucracy decided they liked these icy traditions, the ice from afar became the preferred ice. Interestingly, the importation of ice first increased the desire for ice and grew ice trades all over the world. It increased competition and caused more local snow collectors and ice makers to go into business. Ice became more popular than ever, so the prices dropped. But at the same time, with thermometers, the recognition of gas as stuff, and vacuum pumps and scientific communication, it was also realized that changing the pressure of gases and highly volatile liquids, hot and cold, could actually be specifically controlled. By changing the pressure of stuff, you could literally make cold, or, as people were starting to realize, make heat go away. Reducing the pressure in a system made it colder. Adding pressure caused it to heat up. So with these technologies, this phenomenon could be noticed and recorded in entirely new ways. Versions of thermometers that allowed you to measure changes in temperature have been around for hundreds of years, but many of them were slow. Most of them were not particularly dependable or readable for practical purposes. But accurate, reproducible thermometers started to spread out around Europe and then America in the late 1700s and the early 1800s. And with these, it could be observed that water is hard to heat up and slow to cool down compared to many other materials. The special energy-absorbing properties of melting ice were also observed. The unexpected temperature changes that happen when water and ice hover around the freezing point and different chemicals are added could also be observed and recorded with precision. And as a result, ideas about the nature of cold, what it was, and how it could be made could at last be debated, tested, repeated, and recorded. And right at the same time, the idea and power of cold was starting to come under human control. Tudor was bringing ice to the world, specifically to more people who were not fantastically, unimaginably wealthy. Technology and the ideas were coming together in a way that people realized might soon put creating cold under the control of humans. Winter could be accessible at any time of the year. For up until the 18th century, it was possible to make summer in winter by expending enough fuel. But all of a sudden, the possibility of making things cold by adding effort and energy, that was now within reach as well. So Tudor's ice trade not only altered markets, it was also the source of many of the tools and techniques that would be used in places where the natural harvest of ice would live on, where the reach of machine-made ice would not come even by the end of the 19th century because it made no sense for a very long time. I mean, harvesting ice, that requires special tools. Harvesting snow, not so much a problem. It just gets mined and shoveled like any other diggable material. Creating an ice trade where you could actually buy ice for money, it changed everything. It used to be that ice was simply moved from the pond of an estate to the ice house of an estate. Repurposed farm tools were fine for this, and all they needed was some inefficient labor of otherwise idle slaves or farmhands. So how good the tools were and the quality of the ice didn't matter all that much. But when Tudor decided to make the harvest, storage, and transport of ice a business, well, now the marking, cleaning, and cutting of ice mattered along with the quality, as did storing it so it could be accessed and transported in an efficient, non-wasteful manner. And to go with all this ice moving around, the markets expanded as well. And a big new use was learning how to use ice to move food about the country. Well, cold wine, iced drinks, water ices, and iced cream would make the desire for ice strong enough that creating a global ice business made sense. After the Civil War, the business of moving things around the country using ice will create entirely new kinds of food, including especially the hamburger sandwich. But that's after the next war. Hold on for that. Here in our first part of the 19th century, most of America only gets as far as introducing people who weren't fantastically rich to water ices or early versions of what Americans think of as sherbets, and often say sherberts. Iced juices would appear as treats on plantation porches. Ideas like planter's punch, a mix of rums, tropical juices, tea, and sugar, accompanied by imported ice blocks, would appear at plantation parties. And it was probably this time when the drink we recognize as the modern mint julep, small chips of ice and all, entered the Southern entertaining lexicon. So the early 19th century is when ice was literally delivered to the English-speaking masses for the very first time, and they could not get enough. Now, another thing the English-speaking masses were mad for? Oysters. But this isn't new. What was new was that new markets and sales opportunities for oysters were opening up. And they're about to increase their range across land in ways not seen since the height of the Roman Empire. To learn about that and some other fishy adventures, tune in 2 weeks. But before that, there will be a very special bonus episode next week featuring Nicola Twilley and her new book, Frostbite. That's right, it's another strange kind of crossover. Thanks for listening. Any email, questions, or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episode helps me know you're out there, but even better than that are your reviews. So let people know that you're listening and enjoying the show, or at least that you find it interesting. As always, I'm doing a deep dive into the 19th century with my co-host Jamie Lewis of Plague of Strength in our much looser and rather wilder podcast, Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters. Still contains food, but it also has some fashion, some fighting, some fraud, firearms, and, some other F words, including fun. Coming up is actually our examination of the movie Blazing Saddles, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. And it's an interesting contrast of 1874, 1974, and now. Music for this podcast is Finger Olympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads and Insta and other places around the internet as @THOA Food. And as always, this information and a little bit more is available in the show description.